By this point in the 2020s, the Clone Wars are arguably the most extensively explored period in Star Wars, thanks to the prequels, the Clone Wars multimedia project, the Clone Wars cartoon, other books, shows, and just about every other possible type of media. But for a long time, their exact nature wasn't really solidly known, and the published material of the expanded universe gave some wildly different ideas for what they would be than what we ultimately got. The storytellers of that expanded universe material weren't actually allowed to explore the Clone Wars period directly in their stories, instead leaving that open for George to explore himself if he so chose. But references to the Clone Wars period and the rise of the Empire, directly or indirectly, were very common in books, source books, and comics. Today we're going to focus on two of the bigger elements of these differences, the timing of the Clone Wars, and who exactly was fighting whom, because it's not really who you'd expect. First up, the timing. As we now know, the Clone Wars began with Attack of the Clones set in 22 BBY, or years before the Battle of Yavin, and we also know the war ended 3 years later, alongside the declaration of the Empire and the beginning of the Jedi Purge. But every element of this had received a different depiction earlier on. Novels published by Del Rey in their first run with the license from 1976 to 83, and then Bantam Spectra, who had it from 91 to 99, when Del Rey regained the license and The Phantom Menace released, all tended to follow a similar timeline, where the Clone Wars took place about 10 years earlier than they actually ended up being set, which throws off the age of some Legends characters, and also involved the declaration of the Empire and the fall of the Jedi taking place over a few years in its aftermath, as opposed to being immediately at the end of the Clone Wars. The X-Wing books have a museum visited by Wedge Antilles on Coruscant, hitting at the latter bits of that. According to the museum exhibit, after the resolution of the Clone Wars, the Jedi began to move towards an open grab for power. Senator Palpatine circumvented them and deposed their puppet. The events it goes on to describe relating to the Jedi aren't hugely inconsistent with what happens in the prequels, but the intention in the book's description seems to be trying to get across points to a longer and more protracted power struggle before the actual Purge, rather than the Purge being something immediately after the war, or even as part of the resolution of the Clone Wars, especially like Order 66 was. On the other hand, the references to the removal of a puppet leader after the Clone Wars and before Palpatine's rise to power, or being part of Palpatine's rise to power, support this interpretation of a longer period even further, I think. And it does present a bigger contradiction than the statement about what happened to the Jedi. Even worse, the exhibit says that Palpatine also never liked or subscribed for more videos, which is something you can do right now. One of the clearest ways to track the period of the Clone Wars as the expanded universe authors believe they'd look is the age of Corran Horn and his father Hal Horn, as stated in the X-Wing books, and also the standalone novel retelling the Jedi Academy trilogy from Corran's perspective, I, Jedi. Hal Horn's father, a Jedi named Neja Halcyon, was said to actually have died shortly after the Clone Wars, when Hal was 10. Corran himself is about 24 or 25 in Rogue Squadron, which means he would have been born in 18 BBY, the year after the Clone Wars ended, according to the final timeline of the prequels. Hal therefore would have been about 11 when he had Corran. 11-year-olds with kids is not exactly standard practice, but it does line up perfectly with the author Michael Stackpole thinking the Clone Wars were about 10 to 20 years earlier. You'd then have the more reasonable situation where Hal has Corran when he's between 21 and 31. There's another reference by Stackpole later on in the X-Wing books where Corran is within another part of the museum relating to the Jedi, saying, quote, "A Jedi museum. Everything pertained in one way or another to Jedi Knights and Masters, with the vast majority of them having served in the Clone Wars. Just over 40 years ago, all of these people were alive." Obviously, this isn't a clear direct statement that the Clone Wars were 40 years before, which would put them at least at 37 BBY, since it's saying those people were just alive at that point, but that's incredibly pedantic, and the number does come up elsewhere, which we'll get to next. First, I do want to clarify that a lot of this was of course based on expectations set up by George in the original trilogy, or other plans he may have had influencing what would or wouldn't get approved for publishing, which ultimately changed as he decided more solidly what he wanted to do with the period, something that was well within his rights to do. The authors weren't exactly given a lot to base their work off of, so they kind of just had to make whatever inferences they were allowed to, and a lot of times they were building off each other. At a time where franchise storytelling with one continuity between different media types like this wasn't really common, and where it wasn't really a concern for George personally compared to telling the stories he wanted to tell, it's not surprising that you'd end up with these kinds of discrepancies or changes as time goes on. Any solid details you try to give about a story which hasn't been told are going to be at risk of being overwritten. I'm just focusing on the examples I am because they're the ones that gave the most solid numbers for us to look at compared to what we got later on. You should still, of course, go and read the X-Wing books. They're very good. Another place the 35 to 40-ish BBY Clone Wars ending timeline is supported is the Thrawn trilogy, where in Dark Force Rising, Leia is trying to find out when the Nogri world, Honoghr, became polluted, originally thinking it had been a recent change. Quote, Leia put her hand against the smooth wood of the genealogy chart, her knees suddenly feeling weak with shock. 44 years. Not the 5 or 8 or even 10 that she'd assumed. 44. It didn't happen during the rebellion, she heard herself say. It happened during the Clone Wars. Considering Dark Force Rising takes place in 9 ABY, this puts the Clone Wars in the Thrawn trilogy's depiction at least having started in 35 BBY as opposed to 22 BBY, meaning the Clone Wars here took place at least 3 years before even the Phantom Menace took place. And yes, this means we basically just use carbon dating to figure out the Clone Wars timeline, giving us a pretty precise number for a date which Leia is explicitly saying was within the Clone Wars. Something that's very handy for us, but like I said, a risk that went along with transmedia storytelling in the 90s. That general period comes up once again in yet another of Timothy Zahn's books, Vision of the Future, which takes place 10 years after the Thrawn trilogy. Talon Card says at one point in the book, the story of George Cardass goes back about 60 years, to the Clone Wars era, and the chaos that it brought on the galaxy. Of course, he says about, so he's not being exact, but exactly 60 years before would have been 41 BBY, a whole 2 decades before the established Clone Wars. You can also use his use of the word era as a way to make this statement work a bit better with the timeline we ended up getting. But again, this isn't about pointing out discrepancies for their own sake, it's just about trying to get a sense for what the authors thought the period was like at the time. And it's something that isn't necessarily consistent between all books and all mediums. For example, the early Marvel comics take yet another approach to the timeline of the Clone Wars. Marvel Star Wars issue 68 was actually released half a year before even Return of the Jedi, so some details from the original trilogy weren't even established yet. In this issue, a Mandalorian named Fen Shaisa references being sent into the Clone Wars by Mandalore on the side of the Emperor, who was setting up his empire concurrently with the Clone Wars, and that he first became familiar with Leia during briefings on the Empire's enemies. After that, he references the war finally ending. Since Leia is not just alive but an active participant in the galaxy's activities, this means the Clone Wars have to take place much later than both the events of the novels and the events of the prequels. It also gives a different interpretation of Mandalorian involvement with both the Clone Wars and Empire than we later got in basically any portrayal. But a lot of that got handled through direct retcons later, and the Marvel comics were always kind of seen as a lower tier of canon than pretty much anything else. The issues with the timeline there were never really attempted to be addressed, and I think it would be pretty difficult to address that. This also does give us a pretty good jumping off point to get to the other topic of today's video though, exactly who was fighting who in the Clone Wars. Well, we know the Clone Wars were between the Republic and the CIS now, with clones on the Republic side and droids on the CIS side, along with a vast array of local forces you would see in any given theater of the war. The early depiction of the Clone Wars tend to reference it as though the clones were a menace to the galaxy, unleashed by their clone masters and used to assault the Republic, while also regularly going mad and driving up the destruction of the war through that madness. One of the earliest bits of expanded universe media, albeit one which was never really treated as canon, went this direction and introduced Atha Prime as part of the Kenner toy line about a year after Return of the Jedi. He was one of those aforementioned clone masters, a term which did get thrown around a lot in different sources, and he was said to have been banished by Palpatine for his role in starting the Clone Wars. With Thrawn's attempts to create his own clone army being a big focus of the Thrawn trilogy, these kinds of references to the Clone Wars and their clone masters and some kind of Star Wars attack of the clones against the Republic come up quite a lot. This version of the Clone Wars is even used as a reason that Mara Jade, future wife of Luke Skywalker, would want to help the New Republic against the Empire when she says, quote, "The only reason I'm here is because I know a little about the Clone Wars era and don't want to see a bunch of cold-faced duplicates trying to overrun the galaxy again," end quote. This idea was also used as the cause behind a stigma against clones in the galaxy, with cloning being kind of a taboo technology and clones being at best second-class citizens. A decade after the Thrawn trilogy, during the Hand of Thrawn duology, also by Tim Zahn, Leia and Han come across several clones of an Imperial ace pilot named Suntir Fel, who'd been made by Thrawn and who were concerned about their place in the galaxy if they revealed themselves because of that stigma surrounding clones. Quote, Carib shook his head. We have no friends, he said, and if we're a long way past the Clone Wars, we're not nearly so far past Grand Admiral Thrawn's use of soldiers like us in his bid for power. Realistically, this was probably a fairly accurate portrayal of clones and how they were seen in the galaxy, even with what ended up happening in the prequels, where the clones were the army of the Republic, because they were still used by Palpatine in his own bid for power, not just in Thrawn's later one. Notably, this fear for droid armies rampaging across the galaxy isn't really present. Even Pelion, who wouldn't have had a problem with Palpatine's rise to power, did have strong feelings against clones as well. He'd served in the Republic fleet during the Clone Wars, and he reacts explosively to the fact that Joruus C'baoth, the Jedi Master who Thrawn had brought aboard, had actually been a clone. Pelion's comments explicitly reference a fight against a bunch of clones that were going mad by the Republic fleet, and it even shows some of the prejudice that Carib Devist and his brothers were afraid of. Thrawn also makes note of the additional vowels being put in Joruus C'baoth's name, compared to the name of the original Joruus C'baoth, being a way to tell he was a clone, which implies that this was a kind of common practice if that's how Thrawn was able to notice, and also that the clone armies weren't necessarily clones of the same guy. Instead, it was a situation where clones of a bunch of people were probably running around and everyone had to fight themselves, like in Pokemon the first movie with Mewtwo. All in all, these are some pretty different ideas of the Clone Wars, and I think the topic as a whole gives some insight into just how differently transmedia storytelling and the need for continuity, or the lack thereof, was seen over the course of Star Wars' development. Thank you for watching, remember to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.